One of the reasons I think Ecclesiastes resonates so much at this particular moment in our life in the world is the teacher's exceptionally realistic outlook on the world. Kohelet, the teacher, sees the absurdity of political life, the banality of injustice, the ephemerality of venerated institutions, and pronounces it all vanity, futility, emptiness. It is, on the surface at least, a book with a rather pessimistic outlook on life. The teacher's offerings in Ecclesiastes really provide no easy answers for all that he sees going on in the world. And easy answers would fall on incredulous ears right about now in our lives, wouldn't they? The book of Ecclesiastes meets us where we are in a very particular way right now. There are several elements throughout the book that indicate the ways that the teacher is finding and cultivating a sense of grounding and rootedness and mooring, solidity in her frustrating search for wisdom. One of them is the olam, the antiquity and futurity of the earth itself that we discussed last week. Another is stated quite clearly in this verse from chapter 2. There is nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and to find enjoyment in their toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from God, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? I decided to record this sermon in a room that has been so full of our own eating and drinking and enjoyment of one another and the work that we are collectively up to in the world. The parish hall is the site of so many of our meals together that bind us together in community, so much laughter and so much joy. Over the 150 years that this building has stood here as a home to this congregation, it's a time that we really miss right now in our lives during the pandemic. So I draw on the joy that has soaked into the crevices of this room to talk with you about the importance of joy at a time in our lives when it may seem really hard to muster at this point. Here is how we know that joy is not just some momentary musing for the teacher. The encouragement toward enjoyment in life shows up throughout the text in the imperative mood. That is a very rare mood for Kohelet to use in this book. It is something of a command. In other words, the teacher says something like, here are a lot of musings and thoughts about life and death and wisdom and futility. But if it's one thing I'm saying to you with certainty, it is that you should enjoy life however you can, as long as you are able. Take a look at some of these passages. From chapter 5, this is what I have seen to be good. It is fitting to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all of the toil with which one toils under the sun for the few days of the life God gives us, for this is our lot. From chapter 8, so I commend enjoyment, for there is nothing better for people under the sun than to eat and drink and enjoy themselves, for this will go with them in their toil through the days of life that God gives them under the sun. From chapter 9, go eat your bread with enjoyment and drink your wine with a merry heart. And if you're really paying attention to the emotional tone of this book of Ecclesiastes, you can't take these passages lightly. At first glance, they seem to be so uncharacteristic of what the teacher is saying in these pages, and a message that sounds so desperate and despondent about all that is occurring in his world. But the imperative to enjoy life is one of the major sub-themes that runs throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, from beginning to end. So I want to ask you, to begin with, to suspend your belief that joy is a feeling that we either have at times or don't have at others. Because if we think of joy simply as a feeling, then it's pretty easy for many of us right now in our lives to dismiss the teacher's instructions. We don't feel joy amid the intense losses of intimate loved ones or the collective losses of our venerated leaders. We don't feel joy at the constant onslaught of news that suggests looming catastrophe with the climate, with the economy, with democracy. It might even be helpful to substitute other words for joy that are less tied to an assumption of an emotional feeling or state. Words like enjoyment or pleasure, both of which resonate with what Kohelet is encouraging throughout the text of Ecclesiastes. So if joy and pleasure and enjoyment aren't states to be simply felt, I want to help us see the ways that these are resources to practice in the days ahead when the absurdity and the ephemerality of life become quite palpable for us. But listen, this is important. Cultivating joy and pleasure and enjoyment in life are not practices of self-care. Things we do so that we can have the energy to go and do the real work that we are up to in the world. These are resources that are integral to any community undertaking the ministry of compassion and peace and justice. And here's why. Practicing joy is humanizing in a way that resists the objectification of people in a social context that constantly tries to commodify our lives. In the Ptolemaic Empire, out of which Kohelet is writing, there is an intense focus on production in a new and burgeoning economic scene. The worker in this burgeoning economic context in the Ptolemaic Empire was divorced from the enjoyment of what her labor produced. The laborer became an object who was producing objects. And the assessment of a job well done had nothing to do with satisfaction or the sustenance that the laborer's work produced. Instead, it was all about productivity and the accumulation of wealth for a few. Kohelet constantly disparages this economic state throughout the book. And we too live in a system of neoliberalism and predatory capitalism that seeks to maximize profits, commodify care for and with others, cultivate a sense of perpetual dissatisfaction, and an insatiable desire for acquisition and accumulation, turning the gifts of the earth for life and well-being into resources for consumption. In that kind of economic and political system, the cultivation of pleasure in life and the practices of joy and enjoying our experience of the world, these are counter-cultural modes of resistance within a dehumanizing system. Elza Tamez, writing of Ecclesiastes from a liberationist perspective, fully aware of the dehumanizing practices in Kohelet's world and in our own, describes Kohelet's orientation toward joy, saying, "For Kohelet, one of the greatest obstacles to human fulfillment is the inability to enjoy life while one is living. For him, there is nothing worse than being unable to taste happiness, at least momentarily." Square in the middle of dehumanizing forces that serve to separate us from one another, to separate us from the sources of pleasure in our work, from the enjoyment of an ethic of care and a society characterized by justice, pleasure and enjoyment become not simply feelings that we might be fortunate enough to have from time to time. These become tools of resistance to dehumanization. But of course, like everything else in Ecclesiastes, this is not an easy answer to life's difficulties. The teacher writes of joy with eyes wide open to the realities he faces in his world. In fact, Kohelet is writing about the absurdity and futility of life and the affirmation of joy with a constant eye toward the impending reality of death. This will become a topic for our focus in future weeks, but for now, it is enough to say that death itself, for the teacher and for many others, elevates the role of joy to a place of resistance to death-dealing economic and political systems. You're probably familiar with the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was hanged at 39 years old for engaging in a plot to kill Hitler and overthrow the Nazi government. It was from his Nazi prison cell that Bonhoeffer reflected on Ecclesiastes and the role of joy in life, decrying any notion that a follower of Christ and lover of God should deny the role of enjoying life's pleasures and defer any potential for enjoyment to a heavenly reward that has played so large in the Christian imagination. From his Nazi prison cell, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote, "Love God in our life and in the good things God gives us. To say it clearly, that a person in the arms of his wife should long for the hereafter is, to put it mildly, tasteless. And in any case, it is not God's will. One should find and love God in what God directly gives us." But for a long time, the conspiracy between capitalism and colonization and Christianity have served to cut us off from the pleasures of life, the pleasures of sex, the pleasures of work, the pleasures of our body, the pleasures of connection to a larger web of life. This is especially experienced in the lives of Black people who have been cut off from the pleasures of labor through systems of slavery and colonization. And for women who have been cut off from the pleasures of their own bodies by a misogynistic view of the female body. And by queer people who have been cut off from the pleasures of sex and intimate relationality by heteropatriarchal norms that are enshrined in law and medicine and religion. That's why practicing joy is an anti-colonial, feminist, queer resource for cultivating a more just world. There's been no greater advocate for the role of joy and pleasure and the erotic in the work of justice than the great warrior poet Audre Lorde. In her work to transcend the dictates of racist and patriarchal and anti-erotic society, Lorde held up the erotic as a source of power for women. She even saw the potential of joy as a force of reconciliation between people, saying, "The sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers, which can be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them, and lessens the threat of their difference." Now, if we can get with Lorde around this notion of the erotic as power and joy as a reconciling force, can you see how dangerous the threat of pleasure and enjoyment have seemed to those maintaining the power of racism and patriarchy and heteronormativity and capitalism and colonialism over the centuries. So powerful a source of potential resistance that these oppressive forces would need to cut us off from sources of pleasure, of our bodies, of our sexualities, of our relationship to work, of our relationship to the earth, by a confluence of powerful discourses upheld by capitalism, colonialism, and even Christianity itself. Joy, pleasure, enjoyment is a powerful and dangerous and subversive resource for the work of justice. And that should make us really curious about what we're missing in our striving for compassion and peace and justice in the world if we are undertaking that work devoid of a focus on cultivating pleasure and practicing joy, or by treating enjoyment of life as simply a secondary matter of self-care. Perhaps in that context, even the work of justice without the presence of pleasure and enjoyment, our otherwise good work comes to resemble the very forces of oppression and injustice and violence that we seek to dismantle. That's why I think as Christians doing the work of compassion and peace and justice in a theologically rooted way, we need to see practicing joy as eschatological, portending the type of realm in which we want to live. Eschatology is a word we usually associate with the end times, but if we look really carefully at the Christian eschatological tradition, we can see in it a radical dissatisfaction with the current status quo and an anticipatory longing for a world in the midst of becoming. What the book of Revelation talks about as making all things new. Cultivating the practice of joy and the capacity for enjoying life's small gifts and even enjoying the work that we engage in together suggests something about the type of world we want to live in contrast to a current system that cuts us off from the pleasures of our body and our work and each other and the earth. I've been especially taken with how Adrienne Marie Brown describes the role of pleasure in our quests for freedom in her discussion of what she terms pleasure activism. Rather than quote her, I want to play you a compelling clip of Brown describing what she means here.
I realize that we're not the only ones, that almost every human on earth in some way has been disconnected from their natural relationship to the planet, from their natural relationship to themselves, from our natural relationships to each other. And that pleasure is one of the ways we know, like, oh God, I'm in nature. Oh God, I'm with my lover. Oh God, I'm connected. I'm part of something. I belong. I'm safe. Pleasure lets us know all that, right? So for me, I was just like, it's actually a measure of freedom. It's a way that we say, I have decolonized. I have returned to myself. I have been healing.
So I want to ask you, in the days immediately to come, how can we imagine cultivating joy as a spiritual practice, an element of justice practice even, during this especially tumultuous time in our lives, even amidst a pandemic that keeps us physically apart from one another so much of the time, even amid the portents of impending political turmoil? In the coming days, full of news that will distress us and calls to action that will draw upon our time and energy in ways that will feel extreme to us, I want to invite you to seriously consider these questions, both individually and collectively, as the life of the community here at Old Cambridge Baptist Church, because these are not questions secondary to our work of justice, but integral to that work. Where are you already encountering pleasure, enjoyment, joy in the ways that you live your life that may currently be going unnoticed? And how will you pledge to practice joy in the coming days, as well as contribute to the enjoyment of life's pleasures for others? I look forward to exploring these questions with you in the days to come.